I put out a call on my social media platforms to see if anyone had questions. Brief disclaimer, several of these questions could be video topics just in and of themselves. First question, how different is colorism between male and female representation? It starts with the assumption that darker skinned people are somehow inherently masculine, and so the close association and stereotype of masculinity and dark skin is very, very prevalent and pervasive even across racial groups and ethnic groups. When we look at the representation in movies and music and commercials, oftentimes the men have a darker skin tone than the women, right? Just to give a high level overview. Now, when you look across sexual orientation and gender expressions, even those who are more masculine presenting or who identify more masculine, they're often portrayed or cast as darker skinned individuals, right? So even in same-sex couples or lesbian couples, the one who presents as more masculine, quote unquote, is often cast with a darker skinned actress, and the person in that relationship who's portrayed or perceived as being more feminine or having what we culturally assume more feminine mannerisms and a more feminine appearance, they are more often cast with a light-skinned actress. And so pay attention to this, not just in heterosexual couples where the man has darker skin and the woman has a lighter skin tone. Even if she's not considered light-skinned, a lot of times her complexion is still several shades lighter than the man's complexion, so reinforcing that dynamic. But even in, again, queer relationships and queer representation, we see the association continuing where masculine people are often perceived as, or portrayed as rather, being darker skinned. But another point in terms of the difference between men and women and how we're represented in the media is that it's just easier for men because they benefit from patriarchy and sexism, right? And so we know that every societal ill, every social problem has a disproportionate effect on women and girls and femme-presenting people because of sexism, because of misogyny, because of misogyny war. Men not having to deal with sexism, men not having to deal with patriarchy, they just have better career trajectories. They have a level of acknowledgement and recognition in the culture anyway, and that includes internalized patriarchy and internalized misogyny, right? We have more famous dark-skinned men than we have famous dark-skinned women. So this is changing a little bit, I think, as, you know, people like the Issa Raes and the Quinta Brunsons elevate in their status and their agency and power in these industries. We're seeing a change in that, a shift in that. You know, shout out to Abbott Elementary and Insecure, Issa Rae. Historically, and I think even to this day, we have way more famous rappers who are dark-skinned men than we have famous rappers who are dark-skinned women, right? And the same is true for actors. You think about Idris Elba's, Daniel Kaluuya's, Taye Diggs, and all the various dark-skinned black men who just have been hired for project after project after project where they're in leading roles, they're in significant roles. So it's a real obvious, a real clear preference for dark-skinned men and not the same level of desire or interest in portraying and casting and hiring dark-skinned women.
Another question we have is, how can we support people and be good bystanders when colorism occurs? Overarching lesson here is to speak up when you see it happen. The first step is to make sure you can recognize when it happens. Inform yourself about the ways that colorism shows up. Certain phrases people might use, like, oh, you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl, or oh, you should stay out of the sun, or oh, I don't want to get too tan or too dark. Recognize things when people aren't saying something. So noticing how adults treat children of different skin tones, or noticing how when your colleague are showing preferential treatment, or maybe have a pattern of engaging with lighter skinned colleagues a certain way or darker skinned customers a certain way, and starting to just be vigilant in your environment. Really educating yourself on examples of colorism so that it becomes easier for you to spot those instances when they happen. And then the next layer of that is developing and cultivating the courage to respond and speak up. And even if you can't respond in the moment, you might not recognize it in time to step in the moment, but you still have a responsibility to follow up with the people involved. So if you notice something at work and it doesn't occur to you until an hour later that it happened, send a follow-up email, ask for a follow-up meeting or phone call, and just say, hey, I noticed during the meeting, or I noticed during that interaction with the client, can I give you some feedback? Can I share some of my thoughts about what I observed in that interaction? Practice. You have to practice being a good bystander, because a lot of us tell ourselves, oh, I would do something different in that situation. But in that moment when pressure is on, when things are moving fast, past, when there are other things going on around, it's not as easy as it is hypothetically to speak up in the moment. And so just like you would want to be a good bystander for any issue, colorism is really no different. What would you say to a man making a sexist joke? What would you say to someone shoving a little kid on the sidewalk? If you are practiced in being a good citizen and being a good bystander, then colorism is just one facet of that. It's not really a special class of actions or strategies for being a good bystander for colorism. It's any time you see something, say something, right? Just like we do on buses and public transportation.
What are your thoughts on dark-skinned women dating white people and having mixed race children? And I think there was a follow-up question about those Black women then raising sometimes the white children of those white people. What I'll say to anyone is everyone has to be honest and sincere with themselves about their motivations, their intentions. If they are acting and making these decisions with a lack of critical awareness and understanding that our partnering choices are political choices, that love and desire and attraction can be socially conditioned and socially constructed. Anyone in any kind of relationship has to do that work when it comes to colorism, race, sexism, misogyny, misogynoir, heteronormativity, like all these intersecting things, and then some. There's so much that comes to bear on our coupling and partnering choices. But at the end of the day, I don't feel the need to make a blanket statement about the dating choices of Black women, particularly dark-skinned Black women. And actually, I think the blanket statement that I make is that dark-skinned Black women deserve love, whatever form that comes in. And I don't think it's wise for us to sit and wait for one particular narrow version of what that love should look like. My philosophy is that despite these social hierarchies, despite systemic oppression, despite historical marginalization and violence, people are people. I do not subscribe to the notion that any one group of people is inherently better, superior, inferior. I also believe that we are primarily spiritual beings that happen to have incarnated into physical bodies. And so if people are at a point where they and their partner are aware of the implications and the political constructs that they're operating within, I think dark-skinned Black women in particular, because the world and society so often denies us love and recognition, we deserve to get it wherever we find it. Now, I think what your question might be implying is, when are these dark-skinned Black women making these choices and these decisions with a lack of awareness about potentially fetishization, or partnering with people who don't have a social consciousness around power dynamics and privilege. So I think part of the honesty is also that a lot of dark-skinned Black women make dating choices or have dating preferences or end up in certain relationships because they have unhealed colorism trauma. They have unhealed anti-Blackness within themselves. And so I've heard dark-skinned Black women explicitly say that they try to date or marry our partner outside of their race so that their children come out looking a certain way, because just like with Black men who do the same thing, they perceive that partner of a different race as access to greater social capital or greater social status, right? And so whether it's Black men or Black women or people of any race who are making their dating and marriage choices from the place of internalized oppression, I don't think it's healthy, and I don't think it's healthy for the relationship, and I don't think it's healthy for the children. And that could be unhealed anything, right? In this case, we're talking about unhealed, unacknowledged, unrecognized anti-Blackness and colorism and misogynoir. But anytime parents or people are making decisions, especially in something as intimate and significant as a family dynamic, then a lot of times we run the risk of creating or perpetuating more trauma, creating and perpetuating more harm. And yeah, so those are my thoughts on that. Okay, so another question I have is, do you have any spiritual practice, or are you religious? Do you pray? I do consider myself a deeply spiritual person. I believe in divine energy, divine entities. I believe in divine creator. I do prayers, affirmations, meditations. I practice astrology. I read tarot cards and use other forms of divination. I also have conversations with my higher self, my ancestors, pastor. I have sort of a patchwork of religious practices and beliefs that I ascribe to that have been very helpful and very healing for me. It is definitely that sense of spirituality that is at the heart of a lot of what I do and at the heart of what sustains me. Next question. Have you experienced feelings of skepticism when entering Black spaces due to gaining an awareness of colorism in the community? I'm referring to anticipating colorism similar to how we anticipate racism when in white spaces. If so, how have you worked through these feelings? Again, the second half of that question could be a video just in and of itself, but the short answer to the first part of that question is yes, absolutely. I have absolutely anticipated, prepared myself, braced myself to experience colorism in Black spaces, and I have even avoided certain Black spaces because of that fear. This is controversial. This is, again, not a sexy thing to say, but this is the reason why I did not attend an HBCU for college, because I was aware of people I had encountered from HBCUs and their level of colorism and anti-Black racism, internalized anti-Blackness, also classism, and also learning then the history of HBCUs. I was afraid of the experience that I might have at those types of schools. Just my perspective, my honest thoughts and experience and feelings about that. But it's not just HBCUs, it's other Black spaces, and not just the anticipation of it, but the memory of it. And I think that's important to acknowledge as well. We're not just imagining or assuming into the future, but a lot of that anxiety and fear comes from actual memories of when we've experienced anti-Black racism from other Black people, specifically things like colorism and texturism and featureism, right? So yes, absolutely. One of the ways I have navigated it is, to be honest, I don't think that's always a feeling we should try to suppress, because we could actually be protecting ourselves and saving ourselves from entering spaces that really are toxic. There are plenty of Black spaces that really are toxic for dark-skinned Black women, especially those who wear their natural hair, etc. And knowing that, having that awareness of like, oh, this space is actually not safe for me, it's actually quite toxic and quite colorist, is actually a good thing to know. It's a good tool to have. I think where we can learn to maybe better navigate it though and not miss opportunities for connection and community is to approach spaces that we are not really aware of with a sense of openness. But it's really hard to say don't anticipate it or don't be skeptical, right? Because it is a safety precaution, just like you would carry mace if you're walking alone in a dark parking lot at 2 a.m. You know, it's not like, oh, where you're going to get mugged because you're carrying mace. You're anticipating violence happening to you. And it's just, no, it's actually common sense. Given the society that we live in, precaution sometimes is actually necessary. Getting to a place where our precaution and our skepticism and our slow to warm up approach is not necessarily coming from a place of fear, but from a place of self-love. And that might seem like a odd distinction to make. It might be hard to explain. And again, I might need to do a whole video on this. I could actually see another video on this. Being self-protective because I love myself and I deserve to be in community that sees me and that respects me. Not so much of I'm feeling this fear of someone saying something or doing something that's going to crush me or that's going to destroy me or demolish my emotional state in that moment. I hope that is a distinction that you can kind of chew on for a little bit. I really appreciate the question. One thing giving you hope in the conversation about colorism today. I love this question because the work is very difficult. The work is very hard. It's very draining, exhausting, taxing, dangerous in some cases, makes you vulnerable in a lot of cases. It's really clear to me what stands out in my mind. The one thing giving me hope in the conversation around colorism is seeing how many young people are increasingly talking about colorism. There are older generations, when I talk to them, they say, oh, I didn't know it was called colorism. I had never heard of the word. I saw it happening when I was growing up. Then you have people who are sort of in my generation where we're like a transitional generation where we're aware of these terms, but we didn't benefit from popular discourse. We didn't benefit from social media. We didn't benefit from YouTube videos talking about these things. To now now where younger generation students in high school are reaching out to me pretty frequently, pretty consistently from all over the world. People from Australia, Japan, all over the United States who are studying colorism, who have the vocabulary, the critical thinking skills, who are starting to understand historical narratives and systemic oppression, and not only being exposed to these things, but finding it so compelling that they're going to dedicate significant time to studying it, to discussing it, and to raising awareness and spreading awareness. So that's the biggest thing giving me hope.
So this question is, what do you recommend for Black people who don't have the academic language or surroundings, but want to learn how to unpack their own anti-Blackness? Do you know of any layman's or beginner sources? Yes, and I will link to some in the description box below.